After being abandoned by the children, an 88-year-old widow did the final act that shocked everyone. Margaret Thompson's decision would teach a powerful lesson about the choices we make. What made this clever lady with her special message changed lives forever? Are family ties everything in a person's life? The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and wood smoke as Margaret Thompson stood on the porch of her colonial house, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. At 88, she was a fixture in the quaint New England town of Millbrook, as familiar as the changing seasons. "Another beautiful day, Mr. Whiskers," Margaret murmured to her ginger cat, who lounged contentedly in a patch of sunlight. "If only we had someone to share it with." The words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the silence that now permeated the once lively home. Margaret's gaze drifted over the sprawling property, past the ancient oak trees whose branches had cradled tire swings and supported tree houses, to the apple orchard beyond. Those trees had borne witness to decades of family picnics, 4th of July barbecues, and boisterous Thanksgiving gatherings. Now, they stood as silent sentinels, guardians of memories that seemed to grow more distant with each passing day. Margaret sighed, her breath visible in the cool air. She turned and walked back into the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. Family photos lined the walls, capturing moments frozen in time. Margaret and her late husband Robert on their wedding day. Their children, Sarah and Michael, growing from toddlers to teenagers to adults. Grandchildren who now existed mainly as voices on the other end of infrequent phone calls. As she settled into her favorite armchair, Margaret's eyes fell on a framed photo on the side table. It showed her and Robert, much younger, standing proudly in front of their newly purchased colonial house. The memory of that day washed over her, as vivid as the autumn colors outside. "Oh, Maggie," Robert had said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "Just think of the life we'll build here, the memories we'll make, and make memories they had." For decades, the old colonial had been the heart of the Thompson family. Margaret could almost hear the echoes of laughter, the patter of little feet, the heated debates around the dinner table. Robert's booming laugh, Sarah's piano recitals, Michael's victory whoops when his team won the Little League championship. But Robert had been gone for 5 years now, and the children, well, they had lives of their own in far-off cities. The grandchildren were growing up in a world of smartphones and social media, where Grandma's house was more of a concept than a destination. Margaret stood up, her joints protesting the movement. She walked to the kitchen, where the aroma of baking apples and cinnamon still lingered from her latest pie-making session. Her famous apple pies, once the centerpiece of every family gathering, were now more often shared with neighbors or the local community center. As she washed her mug, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the window above the sink. The face looking back at her was lined with years of laughter and worry, joy and sorrow. But lately, it seemed to her that loneliness had etched the deepest grooves. "Now, Margaret," she said to herself, straightening her shoulders, "no use feeling sorry for yourself. You've had a good life, a beautiful home, 2 wonderful children." She trailed off, her gaze drifting to the phone on the wall. When was the last time it had rung with Sarah or Michael's voice on the other end? Not since... She couldn't quite remember. With a determined nod, Margaret reached for the phone. It was time to reach out, to bridge the growing gap. After all, family was family, no matter the distance between them. Little did Margaret know that this simple act would set in motion a chain of events that would change everything, not just for her, but for everyone she held dear. The shrill ring of a cell phone cut through the bustling atmosphere of a high-rise office in downtown Boston. Sarah Thompson, a sleek figure in a tailored suit, glanced at the caller ID and felt a twinge of guilt. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice a mixture of warmth and distraction. "Is everything okay?" Miles away, in her quiet kitchen, Margaret clutched the landline receiver, relief washing over her at the sound of her daughter's voice. "Sarah, sweetheart. Everything's fine. I just wanted to hear your voice." There was a pause, filled with the unspoken weight of time and distance. Sarah glanced at her computer screen, where an important presentation loomed. "That's nice, Mom. Listen, I'm in the middle of something big here. Can I call you back later?" Margaret's heart sank, but she forced cheerfulness into her voice. "Of course, dear. Don't work too hard. And say hello to the kids for me." As she hung up, Margaret's gaze fell on a family portrait from Sarah's law school graduation. How proud they had all been that day. Now, it felt like looking at strangers. Undeterred, Margaret dialed another number. This time it went straight to voicemail. Michael, it's Mom. I hope you're doing well. Give me a call when you can. I love you. In a bustling San Francisco tech startup, Michael Thompson slipped his phone back into his pocket without listening to the voicemail. He'd call back later, he told himself. There was always later. But later rarely came. Days turned into weeks, and Margaret's calls became less frequent. Her once vibrant world seemed to shrink, confined to the walls of her colonial house and the occasional outing with neighbors. It was during one of these outings, a routine checkup at the local clinic, that Margaret received news that would change everything. Mrs. Thompson, Dr. Evans said gently, I'm afraid there are some concerning results in your tests. We need to run more, but it looks like we might be dealing with something serious. Margaret sat in stunned silence, the doctor's words echoing in her mind. As she drove home, the familiar streets of Millbrook seemed alien, as if she were seeing them for the first time, or the last. That evening, with trembling hands, Margaret picked up the phone again. This time, both Sarah and Michael answered. Mom? Sarah's voice was tinged with surprise. Is everything all right? Margaret took a deep breath. Sarah, Michael, I need you to come home. There's something we need to discuss. The urgency in their mother's voice cut through years of distance. Within days, both Sarah and Michael had arranged to return to Millbrook. As Margaret prepared for their arrival, she couldn't help but notice how empty the house felt, how the rooms seemed to echo with the absence of family. She paused by the mantelpiece, running her fingers over a dusty photo of Robert. Oh, Robert, she whispered. What would you do? The next day, as Margaret stood on the porch watching her children's cars pull into the driveway, a mix of emotions washed over her. Joy at seeing them, anxiety about the conversation to come, and an undercurrent of something else. A steely resolve that surprised even her. Sarah emerged first, her professional demeanor softened by concern. Michael followed, his usual confident stride tempered by uncertainty. As they approached, Margaret opened her arms, enveloping them in a hug that bridged years of absence. Mom, Michael said, pulling back to look at her. What's going on? You sounded so serious on the phone. Margaret smiled, a bittersweet expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. Let's go inside, she said. We have a lot to talk about. As they settled in the living room, the weight of unspoken words hung heavy in the air. Margaret looked at her children, these accomplished adults who had once been the center of her world. She took a deep breath, ready to share the news that would set in motion a chain of events none of them could have anticipated. Little did Sarah and Michael know that their mother's revelation would be just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, legacy, and the true meaning of home. The ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway seemed unnaturally loud as Margaret finished explaining her situation to her children. The diagnosis, the prognosis, the decisions that needed to be made, it all hung in the air like a heavy fog. Sarah was the first to break the silence. Mom, you can't stay here alone. It's not safe. We need to consider other options. Michael nodded in agreement. Sarah's right. There are excellent retirement communities that can provide the care you need. We can start looking right away. Margaret's heart sank. She had hoped, perhaps naively, that her children might offer to spend more time with her, to help her through this difficult period. Instead, their solution was to move her away from the only home she'd known for decades. I don't know, Margaret said hesitantly. This house, it's more than just a building. It's where your father and I built our life together. It's where you grew up. Sarah leaned forward, her expression a mixture of concern and determination. Mom, we understand that, but your health has to come first. Besides, think of the property value. We could sell the house and use the money to ensure you have the best care possible. Something in Margaret's expression must have changed because Michael quickly added, It's what Dad would have wanted, Mom. For you to be safe and well cared for. Margaret stood up abruptly, surprising her children. She walked to the window, looking out at the familiar landscape that had been the backdrop of her life for so long. The old oak tree where Robert had built a treehouse for the kids, the flower beds she tended each spring, the winding driveway where she had taught Sarah and Michael to ride their bikes. She turned back to her children, a new resolve in her eyes. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "I can't stay here alone. If you think a retirement community is best, then that's what we'll do." Sarah and Michael exchanged relieved glances, unaware of the thoughts turning in their mother's mind. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah and Michael, eager to return to their lives, efficiently organized everything. They found a highly rated retirement community called Sunset Grove, arranged for the sale of the house, and began the process of sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. As the moving day approached, Margaret found herself spending long moments in each room, saying silent goodbyes to the spaces that had witnessed so much of her life. In the attic, surrounded by boxes of old photos and mementos, Margaret made a decision. She reached for the phone and dialed a number she rarely used. "Mr. Hawkins? It's Margaret Thompson. I need to make some changes to my will. Can you come by the house tomorrow?" The day of the move dawned bright and clear. Margaret stood on the porch one last time, Mr. Whiskers in her arms, watching as the movers loaded the last of her belongings into the truck. Sarah approached, clipboard in hand. "That's everything, Mom. Are you ready?" Margaret nodded, taking one last look at the colonial house that had been her home for so long. "Yes, I'm ready," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As they drove away, Margaret watched in the rearview mirror as her beloved home disappeared from view. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes, a secret knowledge that this farewell, bittersweet as it was not the end of her story. Little did Sarah and Michael know that their mother, even in this moment of apparent defeat, had set in motion a plan that would teach them all a powerful lesson about the true meaning of family and home. The automatic doors of Sunset Grove Retirement Community slid open with a soft hiss, welcoming Margaret Thompson to her new home. The lobby was bright and airy, with potted plants and comfortable seating areas scattered throughout. Despite the cheerful atmosphere, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of being a stranger in a strange land. Sarah squeezed her mother's hand. "It's nice, isn't it, Mom? And look, they even have a little cafe over there." Margaret nodded absently, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar faces of residents and staff. Mr. Whiskers, secure in his carrier, meowed softly as if sensing her unease. A young woman in scrubs approached them, her smile warm and genuine. "You must be Mrs. Thompson. I'm Lisa, one of the caregivers here. Welcome to Sunset Grove." Margaret managed a small smile. "Thank you, dear. Please, call me Margaret." As Lisa led them on a tour of the facility, Margaret tried to absorb the flood of information. The dining hall, the activity rooms, the gardens, it all blurred together in a whirl of newness that left her feeling overwhelmed. Finally, they reached her new apartment. It was smaller than her old bedroom, but Lisa and the staff had done their best to arrange Margaret's furniture and belongings to make it feel homey. "Well," Michael said, clapping his hands together, "looks like you're all set, Mom. Sarah and I need to head back, but we'll call to check in soon." Margaret's heart sank at the thought of being left alone, but she plastered on a brave smile. "Of course, dears. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." After quick hugs and promises to visit soon, Sarah and Michael were gone, leaving Margaret alone in her new space. She sank into her favorite armchair, finally allowing the tears she'd been holding back to fall. "Oh, Mr. Whiskers," she whispered to the cat curled in her lap. "What have we gotten ourselves into?" The first few weeks at Sunset Grove were a blur of adjustment and loneliness. Margaret went through the motions, attending meals in the dining hall, half-heartedly participating in group activities, but her heart wasn't in it. She missed her old home, her neighbors, the familiar rhythms of her life in Millbrook. It was during one particularly low moment, as Margaret sat alone in the community garden, that Lisa approached her again. "Mind if I join you?" the young caregiver asked, gesturing to the empty bench beside Margaret. Margaret shook her head, and Lisa sat down, her presence somehow comforting in its simplicity. "You know," Lisa said after a moment, "when I first started working here, I thought it would just be a job. But then I met people like you, Margaret. People with stories, with lives full of love and loss and everything in between. It made me realize how much we can learn from each other, if we're willing to listen." Margaret turned to look at Lisa, really seeing her for the first time. There was a kindness in her eyes that reminded Margaret of herself at a younger age. "What's your story, Lisa?" Margaret found herself asking. Lisa's smile turned a bit sad. "Oh, it's nothing special. Single mom, trying to make ends meet. My son, Tommy, he's the light of my life. But it's not easy, you know." As Lisa spoke about her struggles and her dreams for her son, Margaret felt something shift inside her. Here was someone who understood the importance of family, of connection. From that day forward, Margaret's life at Sunset Grove began to change. She started joining in activities with more enthusiasm, sharing stories of her own life with fellow residents. And every day, she looked forward to Lisa's visits, which often included stories about Tommy's latest adventures. One afternoon, as Margaret was showing Lisa some old photo albums, an idea began to form in her mind. She thought about her own children, so distant now, and about Lisa and Tommy, who had brought unexpected joy into her life. "Lisa," Margaret said, her voice thoughtful, "would you and Tommy like to come over for tea this weekend? I make a mean apple pie, you know." Lisa's face lit up. "We'd love to, Margaret. Tommy's been curious about you ever since I told him about Mr. Whiskers." That weekend, as Margaret watched Tommy play with Mr. Whiskers and listened to Lisa's laughter, she felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the same as having her own children and grandchildren around, but it was something equally precious. As Lisa and Tommy were leaving, Tommy turned to Margaret with wide eyes. "Can we come back again, Mrs. Thompson? You're way cooler than Grandma." Margaret laughed, a full, hearty laugh that surprised even her. "Anytime, Tommy. Anytime at all." Watching them leave, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. She may have left her old home behind, but she was beginning to realize that home wasn't just a place, it was the people who filled your life with love and laughter. With a small smile, Margaret returned to her apartment and picked up the phone. It was time to have a chat with Mr. Hawkins about some final adjustments to her will. The soft glow of a desk lamp illuminated Margaret's determined face as she pored over documents spread across her small writing desk. Outside her window, the grounds of Sunset Grove were quiet, most residents long since retired for the night. But Margaret Thompson was wide awake, her mind sharp with purpose. "Now let's see," she murmured to herself, adjusting her reading glasses. "If we allocate this portion here, and then—" A gentle knock at the door interrupted her musings. "Come in," Margaret called, hastily gathering the papers into a neat pile. Lisa poked her head in, her expression concerned. "Margaret, I saw your light on. Is everything okay?" Margaret smiled warmly at the young caregiver who had become such an important part of her life. "Everything's fine, dear. Just catching up on some paperwork." Lisa entered the room, her gaze falling on the stack of documents. "At this hour? You should be resting, Margaret. Doctor's orders, remember?" With a mischievous twinkle in her eye, Margaret replied, "Oh, I suppose you're right. But sometimes, the most important work happens when everyone else is asleep." Sensing there was more to the story, Lisa sat down on the edge of Margaret's bed. "What are you up to, Margaret Thompson?" For a moment, Margaret considered deflecting the question. But looking at Lisa's open, caring face, she felt a surge of affection. This young woman and her son had brought light back into her life when she needed it most. "Can you keep a secret, Lisa?" Margaret asked, her voice low. Lisa nodded solemnly. "Of course." Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm making some changes to my will. Big changes." As Margaret explained her plan, Lisa's eyes widened. "But Margaret, are you sure? What about your children?" A shadow passed over Margaret's face. "Sarah and Michael, they've made their choices. And now, I'm making mine." The next day, Margaret met with Mr. Hawkins, her longtime lawyer, in one of Sunset Grove's private meeting rooms. The elderly attorney listened intently as Margaret outlined her wishes, his pen scratching across his legal pad. "Margaret," Mr. Hawkins said when she had finished, "I've known you and your family for years. Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" Margaret's gaze was steady as she replied, "More certain than I've been about anything in a long time, Charles." As Mr. Hawkins left, promising to have the new will drawn up within the week, Margaret felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had set her plan in motion, a plan that would ensure her legacy lived on in a way she believed truly mattered. Over the next few months, Margaret threw herself into life at Sunset Grove with renewed vigor. She organized a book club, volunteered to teach a baking class, and even started a small garden in one of the community's outdoor spaces. But her favorite times were still the weekends when Lisa and Tommy visited. She taught Tommy how to play chess, listened to his school stories, and always made sure there was a fresh apple pie waiting. One sunny afternoon, as they sat in the garden watching Tommy chase butterflies, Lisa turned to Margaret with a serious expression. "Margaret," she began hesitantly, "I can't help but notice. Sarah and Michael haven't visited in a while, have they?" Margaret's hands stilled in her lap. "No," she said softly. "They haven't. Have you told them? About your health, I mean." Margaret shook her head. "They know I'm not as strong as I used to be. But the details, no. They're busy with their own lives. I don't want to burden them." Lisa's brow furrowed. "But Margaret, they're your children. They should know." For a moment, Margaret was quiet, watching Tommy's carefree play. Then, with a small smile, she said, "Sometimes, Lisa, the family we choose is just as important as the family we're born into. Sarah and Michael, they'll understand eventually. At least I hope they will." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made her decision, set her plan in motion. Whatever came next, she was ready to face it with the quiet strength that had carried her through all of life's challenges. Little did Margaret know that the true test of her plan, and of the bonds of family, both blood and chosen, was just around the corner. The shrill ring of a phone cut through the early morning quiet of Sarah Thompson's Boston apartment. Groggily, she reached for her cell, squinting at the unfamiliar number on the screen. "Hello?" she answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Is this Sarah Thompson?" an unfamiliar voice asked. "Yes, this is she. Ms. Thompson, I'm calling from Sunset Grove Retirement Community. I'm afraid I have some news about your mother, Margaret Thompson." Sarah sat bolt upright, suddenly wide awake. "What's happened? Is she all right?" The voice on the other end softened. "I'm sorry to inform you that your mother passed away peacefully in her sleep last night." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Sarah absorbed the news. Her mother gone? It didn't seem possible. Memories flooded her mind. Her mother's warm hugs, the smell of apple pie in the kitchen, the sound of her laughter. I understand," Sarah managed to say. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll be there as soon as I can." As she hung up, Sarah's hand shook. How long had it been since she'd last visited? Since she'd last called? Guilt washed over her in waves as she dialed her brother's number. Across the country in San Francisco, Michael Thompson was just stepping out of the shower when his phone buzzed. Seeing his sister's name on the caller ID, he answered with a touch of irritation. "Sarah? Do you know what time it is here?" "Michael," Sarah's voice cracked. "It's Mom. She's gone." The news hit Michael like a physical blow. He sank onto the edge of his bed, water from his hair dripping onto the carpet. "What? When? How?" As Sarah relayed the little information she had, Michael's mind raced. Their mother, who had always been there, a constant presence even when they were too busy to call or visit, was gone. And he couldn't remember the last time he'd told her he loved her. Within hours, both Sarah and Michael had booked flights to Boston, their busy lives suddenly on hold in the face of this unexpected loss. As they made their way back to Millbrook, each lost in their own thoughts and regrets, neither could shake the feeling that they had missed something important. They arrived in Millbrook on a crisp autumn day, the trees ablaze with color just as their mother had always loved. The town seemed smaller somehow, quieter, as if it too were mourning Margaret Thompson's passing. At Sunset Grove, they were met by Lisa, their mother's caregiver. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she greeted them with a warmth that took both Sarah and Michael by surprise. "Your mother," Lisa said, her voice thick with emotion, "was a remarkable woman. She touched so many lives here." As Lisa led them to Margaret's apartment to collect her personal belongings, Sarah and Michael exchanged puzzled glances. This wasn't the frail, dependent woman they had imagined their mother becoming. This was someone who had continued to live, to grow, to make connections. Inside the apartment, evidence of their mother's life at Sunset Grove was everywhere. Photos of smiling residents, handmade cards from what appeared to be children, even a small potted herb garden on the windowsill. "She started a garden club," Lisa explained, noticing their surprise. And she taught baking classes. The residents loved her apple pies. Michael picked up a framed photo from the bedside table. It showed their mother, smiling broadly, with Lisa and a young boy he didn't recognize. "Who's this?" he asked. Lisa's expression softened. "That's my son Tommy, your mother." She became like a grandmother to him. The weight of all they had missed settled heavily on Sarah and Michael's shoulders. As they continued to pack up their mother's belongings, they couldn't help but wonder, what other surprises did Margaret Thompson have in store for them? Little did they know, the biggest revelation was yet to come. The law office of Charles Hawkins & Associates stood as a testament to old-world charm in downtown Millbrook. Its wood-paneled walls and leather-bound books created an atmosphere of gravitas fitting for the occasion. Sarah and Michael Thompson sat side by side in high-backed chairs, their postures stiff with anticipation. Across the expansive oak desk, Mr. Hawkins shuffled papers, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Before we begin," Mr. Hawkins said, his voice gentle but firm, "I want to express my condolences. Margaret was not just a client, but a dear friend." The siblings nodded, a lump forming in Sarah's throat. Michael fidgeted with his tie, a nervous habit from childhood. "Now," Mr. Hawkins continued, "as you know, we're here for the reading of your mother's last will and testament. I must inform you that Margaret made some significant changes to her will in the months before her passing." Sarah and Michael exchanged glances. "Changes?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. "What kind of changes?" Mr. Hawkins took a deep breath. "Perhaps it's best if we let Margaret explain in her own words." He pulled out an envelope, Margaret's familiar handwriting visible on the front. She left this letter to be read before the will itself. As Mr. Hawkins began to read, Margaret's voice seemed to fill the room. "My dearest Sarah and Michael, if you're hearing this, then I've moved on to whatever adventure comes next. I hope you can forgive me for the surprise I'm about to spring on you. But then again, mothers are allowed their little secrets, aren't they? When you moved me to Sunset Grove, I was hurt. I felt abandoned, cast aside like an old shoe that no longer fit. But life has a funny way of opening new doors when old ones close. At Sunset Grove, I found a new purpose, new friends, and a chance to make a difference. I've decided to leave the majority of my estate, including our family home, to Lisa Jenkins and her son Tommy. Lisa has been more than a caregiver. She's become the daughter I needed in my final years. And Tommy? Well, he brought the laughter of a grandchild back into my life. The house will be converted into a community center for underprivileged children, a place where they can learn, grow, and feel the warmth of a real home. It's my way of ensuring that the love that filled our home continues to touch lives for years to come. I'm also leaving a significant portion to the local animal shelter. Mr. Whiskers sends his purrs of approval. To you, my children, I leave our family photo albums and a hope that you'll remember the importance of presence, of love given freely, of family, both the one you're born with and the one you choose. I love you both, more than words can say. I hope that one day you'll understand why I made this choice. All my love, Mom. As Mr. Hawkins finished reading, a heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah's face had drained of color, while Michael sat in stunned disbelief. This can't be right, Michael finally sputtered. There must be some mistake. Mr. Hawkins shook his head. I assure you, everything is in order. Margaret was of sound mind when she made these changes. Sarah leaned forward, her voice shaking. But the house, our inheritance, she's giving it all away to strangers. Not strangers, Mr. Hawkins corrected gently. People who became very dear to your mother in her final years. As the reality of the situation sank in, a maelstrom of emotions swept through the siblings. Shock, anger, guilt, and a profound sense of loss battled for dominance. I don't understand, Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. We were her children. Didn't that mean anything? Mr. Hawkins leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. If I may offer a perspective, he said, I've known your mother for many years. This decision wasn't made lightly, nor was it made out of malice. Margaret loved you both very much, but she also recognized the power of choosing to love, of building family through action and presence. Michael stood abruptly, pacing the room. So that's it? She's punishing us for having our own lives. No, Mr. Hawkins replied firmly. She's leaving you a legacy far more valuable than money or property. She's leaving you a lesson about what truly matters in life. As the initial shock began to subside, Sarah and Michael found themselves facing uncomfortable truths. How often had they called, visited, made their mother a priority in their busy lives? Mr. Hawkins cleared his throat. There's one more thing. Margaret left instructions for a gathering at the house this weekend. She hoped you both would attend, to meet the people who became her family in her final years. Sarah and Michael exchanged glances, a mix of reluctance and curiosity in their eyes. Little did they know that this gathering would be the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything they thought they knew about family, legacy, and the true meaning of home. The old colonial house stood bathed in warm afternoon sunlight, its windows gleaming as if welcoming old friends. The sprawling front lawn, once a playground for young Sarah and Michael, was now dotted with folding chairs and tables laden with food. Sarah and Michael stood at the edge of the property, watching as people from all walks of life mingled and chatted. The atmosphere was one of celebration rather than mourning, filled with laughter and shared memories of Margaret. I can't believe this, Michael muttered, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. It's like a party. Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd. Mom always did know how to bring people together. As they hesitated, unsure of their place in this gathering, a familiar face approached. It was Lisa, the caregiver they had met at Sunset Grove, with a young boy in tow. Sarah, Michael, Lisa greeted them warmly. I'm so glad you came. Your mother would have been thrilled. The boy beside her looked up with curious eyes. Are you Margaret's kids? He asked bluntly. I'm Tommy. She taught me how to make apple pie. Despite themselves, Sarah and Michael couldn't help but smile at Tommy's enthusiasm. It's nice to meet you, Tommy, Sarah said softly. I'm glad you got to know our mom. As Lisa guided them through the crowd, introducing them to residents from Sunset Grove, neighbors, and community members, Sarah and Michael began to see a side of their mother they had never known. They met Mr. Johnson, an elderly veteran who credited Margaret's baking classes with giving him a reason to get up in the morning. They spoke with Mrs. Chen, whose granddaughter had found a safe haven in Margaret's impromptu after-school program. Your mother, Mrs. Chen said, her eyes shining. She understood that it takes a village. She became that village for so many of us. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah and Michael found themselves drawn into conversations, sharing their own memories of growing up in the house. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, they felt a connection to their mother's world. The mayor of Millbrook approached them, his hand extended. Sarah, Michael, I'm so glad to finally meet you. Your mother was a true pillar of our community. Michael shook the mayor's hand, his brow furrowed. I'm starting to realize we didn't know her as well as we thought. The mayor nodded understandingly. Margaret had a vision for this town, you know. This community center she's gifted us. It's going to change lives. As he explained the plans for the center after-school programs, adult education classes, a safe space for at-risk youth, Sarah and Michael began to see the magnitude of their mother's legacy. She always was a force of nature, Sarah murmured, a mix of pride and regret in her voice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Lisa called for everyone's attention. She stood on the porch, Tommy by her side, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Margaret Thompson, she began, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd, was more than just a resident of Sunset Grove or a neighbor. She was a friend, a teacher, a surrogate grandmother to many. She showed us that family isn't just about blood. It's about love, presence, and choosing to make a difference in each other's lives. As Lisa spoke about Margaret's impact on the community and her plans for the future, Sarah and Michael found themselves moved in ways they hadn't expected. They saw their mother through new eyes, not just as the woman who had raised them, but as someone who had continued to grow, to love, and to make a difference long after they had moved away. When Lisa finished speaking, she turned to Sarah and Michael. Would you like to say a few words? The siblings exchanged glances, years of shared history passing between them in an instant. Slowly, they made their way to the porch. Standing before the crowd, Michael cleared his throat. We came here thinking we knew our mother, but today, we've realized how much we had to learn. Sarah nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. Mom always taught us the importance of family. What we didn't understand was how broad her definition of family had become. As they spoke, sharing memories and expressing their commitment to honoring Margaret's legacy, something shifted in the air. It was as if Margaret herself was there, smiling her approval as her children began to understand the true meaning of her final lesson. The gathering at the old colonial house marked not just the end of Margaret Thompson's life, but the beginning of a new chapter for the entire community, a chapter built on the foundation of love, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. 1 year later, the Margaret Thompson Community Center bustled with activity. The once quiet colonial house now rang with the laughter of children, the murmur of adult education classes, and the warm chatter of community gatherings. Sarah stood in what used to be her childhood bedroom, now transformed into a cozy library. She ran her hand along the spines of donated books, a small smile playing on her lips. "Penny for your thoughts?" Michael's voice came from the doorway. Sarah turned to her brother, her eyes bright. "Just thinking about how much has changed. How much we've changed." Michael nodded, stepping into the room. "Who would have thought we'd be spending our weekends volunteering at a community center in Millbrook?" Their laughter was interrupted by Tommy, now a regular fixture at the center, poking his head into the room. "Sarah, Michael, the new batch of apple pies is ready for the bake sale." As they followed Tommy to the kitchen, the siblings marveled at how naturally they had fallen into their roles here. Sarah had taken charge of the adult literacy program, while Michael used his tech skills to set up computer classes for seniors. In the kitchen, they found Lisa overseeing a group of children and elderly residents working together to package the pies. The scene was a testament to Margaret's vision of intergenerational connection. "You know," Lisa said, handing them each a warm slice of pie, "your mother would be so proud of what this place has become, of what you've become." Sarah and Michael exchanged glances, a wealth of understanding passing between them. The past year had been a journey of rediscovery, of their mother, of their community, and of themselves. They had learned that legacy isn't just about what you leave behind, but about the lives you touch and the changes you inspire in others. Margaret's special message in her will had set off a ripple effect that continued to spread through Millbrook and beyond. As they joined the group in the kitchen, laughing and sharing stories, Sarah and Michael felt the presence of their mother more strongly than they had in years. Not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living force that continued to shape their lives and the lives of those around them. The Margaret Thompson Community Center stood as a testament to the power of love, the importance of presence, and the true meaning of family. It was a legacy that would continue to grow and evolve, touching lives for generations to come. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of community and the sweet scent of apple pie, Sarah and Michael knew that they had finally come home, to the family they were born into, and the family they had chosen to embrace. As the sun set over Millbrook, casting a golden glow through the windows of the old colonial house, the laughter and love within seemed to radiate outward, a beacon of hope and connection in an often disconnected world. Margaret Thompson's final lesson continued to teach, to inspire, and to bring people together, a legacy more valuable than any material inheritance could ever be. What did you think of Margaret's decision? Do you agree? Leave a comment with your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I'm sure there will be new videos to surprise you. Like and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. See you soon.